Sarah Bennett stared at the imposing gates of the Al Rahman estate, her heart pounding against her chest. The pristine white mansion loomed before her, its modern architecture a stark contrast to the humble apartment she shared with her 7-year-old son, Tommy. At 32, she never imagined she'd be standing here, about to start a new chapter in her life as a housekeeper for one of the wealthiest businessmen in the city. The position promised stability, something she desperately needed after years of struggling to make ends meet. With Tommy's medical expenses and the rising cost of living, this job was a lifeline she couldn't afford to ignore. The salary was generous, and the living quarters provided would allow her to save money for Tommy's future. As the gates opened automatically, Sarah adjusted her simple black dress and walked up the curved driveway. The perfectly manicured gardens stretched endlessly on either side, dotted with exotic flowers and elegant water features. Everything about the estate screamed opulence and precision, but there was an undeniable coldness to its perfection. The massive front door opened before she could ring the bell, revealing Mrs. Crawford, the head of household staff. The older woman's steel-grey hair was pulled back in a severe bun, her expression equally rigid. "Miss Bennett punctual. Good, follow me." Her clipped British accent echoed through the marble foyer as she led Sarah inside. The interior of the mansion was even more impressive than its exterior. Crystal chandeliers cast rainbow-like reflections across polished floors, and priceless artwork adorned every wall. Yet despite its grandeur, the house felt eerily quiet, almost sterile in its perfection. "Mr. Al Rahman is rarely home due to his business commitments," Mrs. Crawford explained as they walked. "His son, Kareem, lives here with his governess. Miss Phillips, you'll be responsible for maintaining the East Wing, including the library and Kareem's quarters. Under no circumstances are you to disturb either of them unless specifically requested." As they passed through a corridor, Sarah caught a glimpse of a small figure standing by a window, a boy no more than 5 or 6 years old, dressed in an impeccable private school uniform. His dark eyes met hers briefly before he turned away, shoulders hunched as if carrying an invisible weight. "That's young Master Kareem," Mrs. Crawford whispered, ushering Sarah along. "Remember, minimal interaction. Miss Phillips handles all matters concerning the child." Something in the boy's expression tugged at Sarah's heart. She recognized that look, the same one Tommy had worn during their hardest times, when she'd worked multiple jobs and could barely spend time with him. It was the look of a child desperate for connection. The tour continued through the service areas, where Sarah learned about the strict scheduling and exacting standards expected of her. Everything had its place, every task its precise time slot. It was clear that Mr. Al Rahman's business acumen extended to how his household was run, with military precision and minimal room for deviation. Later that evening, as Sarah unpacked her modest belongings in her new quarters, she couldn't shake the image of young Kareem from her mind. The contrast between the mansion's opulence and the emotional poverty she'd witnessed in that brief moment was striking. She thought of Tommy, who was staying with her sister until she got settled, and how different his warm, infectious laugh was from the silence that pervaded these halls. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. Opening the door, she found Mrs. Crawford holding a thick manual. "Your schedule for tomorrow, along with the household protocols. Mr. Al Rahman expects excellence, Miss Bennett. Don't disappoint." The older woman paused, then added in a softer tone, "The last 3 housekeepers didn't last a month. I suggest you focus on your duties and nothing else." As Sarah reviewed the manual that night, she couldn't help but wonder about the stories behind those failed housekeepers. What had happened to make them leave? The answer, she suspected, lay somewhere in the stark contrast between the mansion's physical perfection and its emotional emptiness. Her thoughts drifted to Tommy, and she pulled out her phone to text him goodnight. As she typed, she glanced at the manual again, noting the rigid structure of her days to come. Something told her that beneath the surface of this perfectly ordered household lay complicated dynamics that no manual could prepare her for. But she was determined to succeed, not just for Tommy's sake, but perhaps for young Kareem's as well. The first weeks at the Al Rahman estate fell into a predictable rhythm. Sarah learned to navigate the mansion's elaborate layout and master its demanding schedule. Each morning began before dawn, preparing the East Wing for the day ahead. She developed a sixth sense for anticipating needs before they arose, earning grudging approval from Mrs. Crawford. But it was the glimpses of Kareem that continued to captivate her attention. The boy moved through the mansion like a ghost, always. Under the watchful eye of Miss Phillips, a tall woman whose perpetual frown seemed carved into her features, Sarah observed their interactions during her duties, the way Miss Phillips corrected Kareem's posture with sharp taps of her ruler, how she interrupted his rare moments of childish enthusiasm with stern reminders about proper behavior. One afternoon, while dusting the library shelves, Sarah heard muffled sniffling coming from behind a heavy curtain. Pulling it back slightly, she found Kareem huddled in the window seat, clutching a worn teddy bear, the only item in the entire mansion that showed signs of genuine use and love. "Are you all right?" she whispered, kneeling beside him. Kareem quickly wiped his eyes, straightening his shoulders like a soldier at attention. "I'm fine, thank you," he replied formally, but his voice trembled. "You know," Sarah said, sitting down beside him, "my son Tommy has a bear just like that. His name is Captain Brave because he helps Tommy feel strong when he's scared or sad." Something in Kareem's expression shifted, a flicker of interest breaking through his careful mask. "Really?" he whispered. "Mine is called Mr. Hugs. But Miss Phillips says I'm too old for him now." Sarah's heart clenched. "I don't think anyone's ever too old for a friend who gives good hugs," she replied, smiling warmly. "Would you like to see a magic trick?" Before Kareem could respond, the sharp click of heels announced Miss Phillips's approach. Sarah quickly stood, resuming her dusting as Kareem tucked Mr. Hugs out of sight. The governess appeared around the corner, her suspicious gaze darting between them. "Master Kareem, it's time for your French lessons," she announced coldly. "And Miss Bennet, I believe Mrs. Crawford needs you in the kitchen." That evening, Sarah received a formal warning from Mrs. Crawford about maintaining professional boundaries. But she couldn't forget the brief moment when Kareem's face had lit up at the mention of magic tricks. It reminded her so much of Tommy that it hurt. Over the next few days, Sarah began leaving small origami animals in places where Kareem would find them. A paper crane on his windowsill, a jumping frog by his breakfast plate. She never let herself be seen placing them, but she caught glimpses of his delighted reactions when he discovered each one. The paper menagerie seemed to work magic of its own. Kareem began to stand straighter, his eyes brighter. Sometimes she'd find carefully folded attempts at origami tucked into the corners. She cleaned, like secret messages in a language of creased paper and hope. One day, while polishing the grand staircase, Sarah overheard a conversation that made her blood run cold. Miss Phillips was speaking to Mrs. Crawford in hushed tones about Mr. Al-Rahman's impending return. "The boy is becoming unmanageable," Miss Phillips complained. "All these childish distractions. I've found paper animals everywhere. He's falling behind in his studies, becoming emotional. Mr. Al-Rahman won't be pleased." "I'll speak to Miss Bennet," Mrs. Crawford replied firmly. "Though I must say I've noticed Master Kareem smiling more lately." "Smiling doesn't prepare one for running a global empire," Miss Phillips snapped. "Mr. Al-Rahman entrusted me with shaping his heir. I won't let some housemaid's sentimental nonsense interfere with that." Sarah's hands trembled as she continued her work. She knew she was walking a dangerous line, but seeing the positive changes in Kareem made it impossible to step back. The boy was awakening from his shell of isolation, showing signs of the child he should have been all along. That night, as she prepared for bed, Sarah found something slipped under her door. A perfectly folded paper heart, clearly made by small, determined hands. Inside, in careful childish writing, were the words, "Thank you for the magic." Sarah held the paper heart carefully, knowing she had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. Mr. Al-Rahman's return loomed on the horizon like an approaching storm, and she had a feeling that the delicate paper world she'd helped create was about to face its greatest test. The mansion's atmosphere shifted dramatically one morning with the arrival of a sleek black car at the front entrance. Hassan Al-Rahman had returned from his business travels, his commanding presence immediately filling the halls. Staff members scurried about with renewed intensity, ensuring everything met his exacting standards. Sarah watched from the upper floor window as the powerful businessman emerged from his vehicle. Despite only being in his early 40s, Hassan al-Rahman carried himself with the gravitas of someone who controlled empires. His tailored suit and perfectly groomed appearance reflected the same precision she'd observed throughout his home. "Father!" Kareem's excited voice echoed through the normally quiet halls as he ran down the grand staircase, breaking every rule of proper behavior Miss Phillips had drilled into him. Sarah held her breath, watching the scene unfold below. Hassan's expression softened slightly at the sight of his son, but his greeting remained formal. "Kareem," he said, placing a hand on the boy's shoulder, "I trust you've been maintaining your studies." The question sounded more like a business transaction than a father's concern. "Yes, father," Kareem replied, his earlier enthusiasm dampening under his father's stern gaze. "I've improved my French pronunciation, and—" He hesitated, then added hopefully, "I've learned to make paper animals too." Hassan's eyebrows furrowed. "Paper animals?" He looked questioningly at Miss Phillips, who had appeared behind Kareem. "A recent distraction," Miss Phillips replied, her tone carrying clear disapproval. "One I've been trying to discourage." "I see." Hassan's expression hardened. "Kareem, such childish pursuits are beneath your station. You are my heir. Your focus should be on your education, not frivolous crafts." Sarah's heart ached as she watched Kareem's shoulders slump. The paper crane he'd been hiding behind his back crumpled slightly in his tightening grip. That evening, Sarah was summoned to Hassan's study. The room, with its dark wood panels and leather-bound books, emanated power and authority. Hassan sat behind an imposing desk, reviewing what appeared to be her employment file. "Miss Bennett," he began without looking up, "your work performance has been satisfactory according to Mrs. Crawford's reports. However, I'm concerned about certain irregularities that have developed during my absence." Sarah stood straight, gathering her courage. "Sir, if you're referring to the origami, I'm referring to the inappropriate attachment you've encouraged with my son," he interrupted, finally meeting her eyes. "Kareem is being groomed for significant responsibilities. He cannot afford distractions or emotional entanglements with household staff." "With all due respect, Mr. Al-Rahman," Sarah replied carefully, "Kareem is still a child. Sometimes children need more than just academic preparation. They need joy, creativity. What children need," Hassan cut in sharply, "is discipline and focus. I built this empire from nothing, Miss Bennett. Every detail of Kareem's upbringing has been carefully planned to ensure he's prepared to carry on that legacy. I don't expect someone of your background to understand the complexities involved." The dismissive tone in his voice sparked something in Sarah. She thought of Tommy, of how his laughter had dimmed during their hardest times, and of how Kareem's eyes had lit up at simple paper animals and magic tricks. "Perhaps it's you who doesn't." "Understand, sir," she said quietly but firmly. "I've seen how Kareem comes alive when he's allowed to be himself. Your empire may need an heir, but your son needs a father." The silence that followed was deafening. Hassan's expression darkened, and for a moment Sarah was certain she'd just lost her job. But instead of firing her immediately, he leaned back, in his chair, studying her with an unreadable expression. "You're very bold, Miss Bennett," he finally said. "Or very foolish, possibly both. Tell me, why do you care so much about my son's emotional well-being?" "Because every child deserves to feel loved and valued for who they are, not just what they might become," she answered honestly. "I see so much of my own son in Kareem, their creativity, their sensitivity, their need for connection. And I've seen what happens when those needs go unmet." Something flickered in Hassan's eyes, a brief crack in his carefully maintained facade. He stood, walking to the window that overlooked the garden where Kareem often played alone. "You have until the end of the week to find new employment, Miss Bennett," he said finally, his voice tight with controlled emotion. "I suggest you use your remaining time to focus solely on your prescribed duties." Sarah left the study with a heavy heart, knowing she'd crossed a line from which there was no return. But as she walked through the quiet halls, she caught sight of a small figure hiding behind a curtain, Kareem clutching Mr. Hugs and a crumpled paper crane. The news of Sarah's impending departure spread through the mansion like wildfire. The staff, who had grown accustomed to the subtle warmth she brought to the household, watched her with a mixture of sympathy and resignation. But it was Mrs. Crawford's reaction that surprised Sarah the most. The usually stern head of household caught up with her one evening as she finished her duties. "Come with me," she said quietly, leading Sarah to her private office, a small room filled with decades of household records and memories. "Sit," Mrs. Crawford commanded, closing the door behind them. She moved to an antique filing cabinet, pulling out a worn photograph album. "I've served in this household for 25 years, she began, her usual crisp tone softening. "I was here when Hassan's father ran the estate, when Hassan himself was just a boy." She opened the album, revealing photographs of a younger Hassan, a dark-eyed child with an infectious smile, playing in the same gardens where Kareem now walked alone. "He was so different then," Mrs. Crawford continued, touching one photo gently. "Full of life, dreams, and yes, even origami animals." Sarah leaned forward, studying the images. "What changed?" "His father," Mrs. Crawford sighed. "A brilliant businessman, but a harsh parent. He believed emotions were weaknesses, that success required sacrificing everything else. When Hassan took over the business, he became exactly what his father demanded: successful, respected, and completely closed off from his own emotions." The older woman closed the album carefully. "And now, Miss Bennett, history is repeating itself. I've watched Kareem fade, just as his father did, until you arrived. For the first time in years, that boy has started to smile again." "But Mr. Al-Rahman doesn't see it that way," Sarah replied, her voice tight with frustration. "He thinks I'm interfering with Kareem's development." "Perhaps," Mrs. Crawford agreed, "but I've also noticed something else. Since your interactions with Kareem began, his academic performance has actually improved. Miss Phillips won't admit it, but the boy's French pronunciation is clearer, his mathematics more precise. It seems Joy is a better teacher than fear." A knock at the door interrupted their conversation. To their surprise, Ahmad, Hassan's personal assistant, entered quietly. The young man's usually composed demeanor showed signs of concern. "Mrs. Crawford, Miss Bennett," he nodded respectfully. "I apologize for the intrusion, but there's something you both need to know." He glanced around before continuing in a hushed voice. "Mr. Al-Rahman has been watching the security footage from the past few weeks, all of it." Sarah's heart sank. The mansion's extensive security system had captured every interaction she'd had with Kareem, every small act of kindness she'd tried to keep hidden. "But that's not all," Ahmad continued. "He's particularly interested in the recordings from his study. The camera caught something unusual last night." He pulled out his tablet, queuing up a video. The footage showed Hassan's study after hours, dimly lit by a desk lamp. Hassan sat at his desk, holding something in his hands, a crumpled paper. Crane carefully being smoothed out and restored. "He spent 3 hours watching the videos of you teaching Kareem origami," Ahmad revealed. "And then he did this." He swiped to another clip, showing Hassan attempting to fold his own paper crane, frustration evident on his face as he repeatedly failed and started over. Mrs. Crawford's expression softened further. "Perhaps there's hope yet," she murmured. "The question is, what do we do with this information?" "We do nothing," Sarah said firmly, surprising herself. "If Hassan is going to change, it has to come from within him. Pushing or manipulating him would only make things worse." Ahmad nodded approvingly. "Wise decision. But Miss Bennett, you should know, the board of directors is pressuring him about the company's future. They're concerned about Kareem's preparation as heir. Some are suggesting sending him to boarding school abroad, where he can be properly molded without distractions." The thought of Kareem being sent away, isolated even further from emotional connections, made Sarah's chest tighten. She stood abruptly, her mind racing with possibilities. "I may have lost my position here," she said, determination replacing her earlier resignation. "But I still have 3 days left, and I intend to use them wisely." Mrs. Crawford raised an eyebrow. "What are you planning?" "Something risky," Sarah admitted. "But sometimes the greatest act of love is showing someone their own capacity to love." She turned to Ahmad. I'll need your help, both of you. And more importantly, I'll need all the security footage you can. Gather, not just of Kareem and me, but of Hassan and his father too. It's time to break this cycle once and for all. Sarah's plan took shape with precision over the next day. With Mrs. Crawford's help, she gained access to the mansion's vast media room, a space usually reserved for business presentations. Ahmad provided her with decades of security footage, family videos, and photographs that told the story of 3 generations of Al Rahman men. Working through the night, she carefully edited together a narrative that revealed the parallel paths of father and son. The footage showed a young Hassan, bright-eyed and creative, gradually transformed by his father's rigid expectations. Then came Kareem, following the same painful journey of suppressed joy and enforced maturity. But Sarah didn't stop there. She included recent footage of Kareem's transformation, his first tentative smile at finding a paper crane, his growing confidence as he mastered each new origami creation, and most importantly, his improved focus and performance in his studies as his spirit lightened. The most powerful clips came from Hassan's own office. The security footage showed him watching his son from the window, his facade cracking as he observed Kareem's recent happiness, and finally, those late-night moments of him attempting to fold paper cranes, his frustration giving way to a glimpse of his former self. On her second-to-last day, Sarah took her biggest risk. She arranged for the presentation to play automatically when Hassan entered the media room for his scheduled board meeting. Ahmad had ensured the board members would be delayed by carefully orchestrated transportation issues, giving them a crucial window of privacy. The moment arrived with Hassan's punctual entrance into the media room. As the doors closed behind him, the lights dimmed and the presentation began to play on the massive screen. Sarah watched from the technical booth as Hassan's expression changed from annoyance to surprise, then to something deeper and more vulnerable. He stood frozen as images of his younger self played across the screen, memories he'd buried beneath. Years of rigid control. The parallels between his childhood and Kareem's were unmistakable. The same bright eyes dimming under pressure, the same straight shoulders carrying too much weight too soon. But then came the recent footage, Kareem's awakening joy, his laughter echoing through the mansion's halls, and most tellingly, his improved performance in every area of his studies. Hassan sank into a chair, his carefully maintained composure crumbling as he watched himself on screen, attempting to fold paper cranes in the middle of the night. The final clip showed Kareem teaching a younger student at his school, patiently demonstrating an origami fold, showing the same leadership qualities Hassan had tried to instill through strict discipline. As the screen faded to black, Sarah entered the room quietly. Hassan didn't turn around, his gaze fixed on the darkened screen. "Your father," he said finally, his voice rough with emotion. "He wanted the best for me, just as I want the best for Kareem." "Of course you do," Sarah replied gently. "But perhaps the best isn't what we think it is. Sometimes it's hidden in the simple things, like paper cranes and magical moments between father and son." Hassan stood slowly, walking to the window that overlooked the garden where Kareem was having his morning lessons with Miss Phillips. The boy sat straight-backed and serious, but his fingers were absently folding the corner of his notebook paper. "I don't know how," Hassan admitted quietly. "I don't know how to be different from what I've become." "Start with a paper crane," Sarah suggested, placing a perfect square of colored paper on the table beside him. "The rest will follow." For a long moment, Hassan stared at the paper, his hands trembling slightly as he reached for it. In that moment, Sarah saw not the powerful businessman, but the young boy from those old videos, the one who had once known how to smile. The board meeting that morning proved unexpectedly transformative. Hassan stood before the directors with a new clarity in his eyes, speaking not just of profit margins and market expansion, but of sustainable growth and human capital. When the topic of Kareem's education arose, he surprised everyone by firmly rejecting the suggestion of sending him to boarding school. "My son will remain here," Hassan declared, his voice carrying an authority that brooked no argument. "I've observed significant improvements in his development recently. His current environment is proving more beneficial than anticipated. Miss Phillips, who stood near the door taking notes, visibly stiffened at his words. Her carefully crafted influence over Kareem's upbringing was being challenged, and she didn't attempt to hide her disapproval. After the meeting, Hassan made an unprecedented request. He asked Mrs. Crawford to clear his afternoon schedule, something that hadn't happened in years, unless necessitated by urgent business matters. The household staff watched in amazement as he made his way to the garden where Kareem was studying. "Miss Phillips," he called out, interrupting Kareem's French lesson, "you may take the rest of the afternoon off." The governess's protest died on her lips at the sight of Hassan's expression. She gathered her materials, shooting a suspicious glance at Sarah, who was trimming nearby roses before departing with rigid dignity. Hassan approached his son, who sat perfectly straight, anxiety visible in his small features. To everyone's surprise, Hassan lowered himself onto the grass beside Kareem, his expensive suit touching the ground without hesitation. "Show me," he said softly, pulling out a piece of paper from his pocket. "Show me how to make a crane." Kareem's eyes widened in disbelief. He looked at the paper, then at his father, then back at the paper. "Really?" he whispered, as if afraid speaking too loudly would break the spell. "Really," Hassan confirmed, and for the first time in years he smiled, a genuine smile that transformed his entire face. Sarah watched from her position by the roses as father and son huddled together over the paper. Kareem's small hands guided his father's larger ones through each fold, his voice growing more confident as he explained each step. Hassan's initial attempts were clumsy, but he persisted, his determination matching the same intensity he usually reserved for business deals. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the garden as the pile of attempted cranes grew. Some were crumpled, others lopsided, but a few began to take recognizable shape. With each attempt, the formal distance between father and son diminished. "Did you know," Kareem ventured during a particularly challenging fold, "that in Japan, they say if you fold 1,000 paper cranes, your wish will come true?" Hassan paused, looking at his son with newfound interest. "What would you wish for, Kareem?" The boy hesitated, then reached into his pocket and pulled out the worn teddy bear he'd been hiding from Miss Phillips. "I wish Mr. Hugs didn't have to be a secret anymore," he admitted quietly. Hassan gently took the bear, examining it with the same care he usually reserved for important contracts. "Does Mr. Hugs help you feel brave?" he asked, remembering Sarah's words about emotional connections. Kareem nodded, watching his father anxiously. Instead of the expected reprimand, Hassan handed the bear back with a gentle pat on its head. "Then Mr. Hugs is welcome to join us any time," he declared. "Now, shall we try another crane?" From her vantage point, Sarah could see Mrs. Crawford and Ahmad watching from an upstairs window, their expressions a mixture of amazement and hope. Miss Phillips observed from another window, her lips pressed into a thin line of disapproval. As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the garden, Hassan held up his final attempt at a paper crane. It wasn't perfect. One wing was slightly crooked and the head was a bit squashed, but Kareem's face lit up with pride. "It's beautiful, father," he exclaimed, forgetting his usual formal restraint. Hassan studied the crane, then looked at his son's radiant face. Something shifted in his expression, a realization dawning that all his wealth and power couldn't compare to the simple joy of this moment. The shift in Hassan's approach to parenting sent ripples through the household hierarchy. Miss Phillips, seeing her influence wane, launched a subtle campaign to maintain her position. During a private meeting with Hassan, she presented a thick folder of educational assessments and developmental benchmarks. "Mr. Al-Rahman," she began, her voice laden with professional concern, "while I appreciate your interest in Kareem's recreational activities, I must express my concerns about recent deviations from his established routine. These distractions could seriously impact his future capabilities as your heir." Hassan sat behind his desk, examining the report she'd prepared. A week ago, these documents would have swayed him immediately. Now he noticed something different. Between the lines of data and assessments, he saw no mention of Kareem's emotional well-being or personal growth. "Miss Phillips," he replied, setting down the folder, "your dedication to Kareem's education has been invaluable. However, I've observed something remarkable lately. My son's French pronunciation has improved significantly since he began teaching his origami skills to his French tutor. His mathematical understanding has deepened through the spatial reasoning required for paper folding. Perhaps we've been too narrow in our definition of education." The governess's composure cracked slightly. "Sir, surely you can't be serious. These childish pursuits were once my own pursuits," Hassan interrupted, pulling out his imperfect paper crane from his desk drawer, "before they were deemed unsuitable for an Al-Rahman heir." The conversation was interrupted by sounds of laughter from the garden. Through the window they could see Kareem showing Sarah's son Tommy, who was visiting for the afternoon, how to fold a paper boat. The two boys had formed an instant connection, their joy evident in their animated gestures and shared excitement. Miss Phillips's lips tightened at the sight. "Mr. Al-Rahman, need I remind you of the social implications of allowing Kareem to associate with domestic staff's children? The board members will adapt," Hassan stated firmly. "As will we all." He stood, signaling the end of the discussion. "Change is necessary for growth, Miss Phillips. I suggest you consider how to incorporate these new elements into Kareem's education, rather than resist them." Later that afternoon, Hassan witnessed another scene that reinforced his decision. He found Kareem in the library, surrounded by books about Japanese culture and mathematical principles of origami. The boy was taking careful notes, his face alight with genuine curiosity. "Father," Kareem exclaimed upon seeing him, "did you know that origami can teach us about algorithms and engineering? Tommy's mother helped me find these books. She says learning is more fun when you love what you're studying." Hassan sat beside his son, picking up one of the books. "She seems very wise, your Sarah," he said, catching himself before saying the housekeeper. "Perhaps we could learn together." The moment was interrupted by Mrs. Crawford, who appeared with an urgent message. The board was requesting an emergency meeting regarding recent policy changes. Hassan's new approach to Kareem's education had sparked concern among the more traditional board members. "Tell them I'll be there shortly," Hassan replied, but he didn't immediately rise. Instead, he turned to Kareem. "Would you like to come with me? Show them what you've been learning." Kareem's eyes widened with a mixture of excitement and anxiety. "But Miss Phillips says I'm not ready for business meetings yet." "Sometimes," Hassan said, helping his son gather his origami books, "the best way to learn is by doing. And sometimes the best teachers are the ones who show us how to find joy in learning." The boardroom fell silent as Hassan entered with Kareem by his side. The boy clutched his origami books and papers close to his chest, his small frame straight but trembling slightly with nervousness. The board members exchanged glances, clearly surprised by the child's presence at such a formal meeting. "Gentlemen," Hassan began, his voice carrying its usual authority, "before we discuss your concerns about recent changes in my son's education, I believe a demonstration is in order." He nodded encouragingly to Kareem, who stepped forward with remarkable poise. "Honorable board members," Kareem started, his voice small but clear, "I would like to show you how origami relates to business." He began distributing precisely folded paper structures to each member, explaining as he went. "These models demonstrate principles of geometry, engineering, and resource optimization." The boy proceeded to give a presentation that left even the most skeptical board members impressed. He explained how the precise folds of origami taught him patience and attention to detail, how the transformation of a flat paper into a three-dimensional structure helped him understand complex mathematical concepts, and how teaching others these skills improved his communication abilities. "In French class," Kareem continued, gaining confidence, "I now explain the folding steps in French, which helps me practice vocabulary and pronunciation. My tutor says my accent has improved significantly." He glanced at his father, who nodded encouragingly. One of the older board members, Mr. Richardson, leaned forward with interest. "Young man, can you explain how this relates to business strategy?" Kareem's face lit up. "Yes, sir. Just like in origami, in business, you start with limited resources, a single square of paper, and must make strategic decisions to create something valuable. Each fold is like a business decision that affects all future possibilities. You can't waste moves, and you must think several steps ahead. The boardroom filled with murmurs of appreciation. Hassan watched with pride as his son fielded questions, with a natural grace that no amount of forced etiquette training could have instilled. This was not the rigid, fearful child of a few weeks ago, but a young boy finding his own voice and confidence. Miss Phillips, who had been observing from the corner, shifted uncomfortably as she watched her carefully constructed educational system being challenged by a child's passion for paper folding. Her expression darkened further when Kareem mentioned how Sarah had helped him discover the educational aspects of his hobby. "Mr. Al-Rahman," she interrupted, "while this is all very charming, surely you can't base your heir's education on understanding resource management, spatial reasoning, and effective communication." Hassan completed her sentence with a raised eyebrow. "On developing the confidence to present complex ideas to a room full of executives? Tell me, Miss Phillips, isn't that exactly what we've been trying to achieve?" The governess fell silent, her face flushing with barely contained frustration. Several board members were now examining their origami structures with genuine interest, some even attempting to recreate the folds under Kareem's patient guidance. "Mr. Al-Rahman," the board chairman spoke up, "I believe we've seen enough to allay our concerns. Your son displays remarkable aptitude and maturity. Perhaps we've been too traditional in our approach to preparing the next generation." As the meeting concluded, Hassan noticed Sarah waiting outside the boardroom, presumably having helped Kareem prepare for his presentation. Their eyes met briefly, and he found himself seeing her not as a housekeeper who had overstepped her bounds, but as someone who had seen potential where others saw only protocol. That evening, as Hassan helped Kareem prepare for bed, another new routine they'd established, the boy asked a question that struck deep. "Father, do you think grandfather would have approved of today?" Hassan paused, remembering his own childhood desires that had been systematically replaced with business principles. "I think," he said carefully, "that your grandfather never had the chance to learn what I'm learning now, that the strongest leaders are those who remain true to themselves." Sarah's last day at the mansion arrived with an unexpected twist. Instead of the customary exit interview with Mrs. Crawford, she received a formal invitation to join Hassan and Kareem for breakfast in the garden. The invitation, handwritten on expensive stationery, carried a personal note requesting her to bring Tommy along. The morning sun cast a gentle glow over the garden as Sarah and Tommy approached the elegantly set table. Kareem immediately brightened at the sight of his friend, while Hassan rose to greet them with newfound warmth in his expression. "Please, join us," Hassan gestured to the seats, where place settings included origami napkins, clearly Kareem's work. "I believe we have some matters to discuss." As they settled in, Sarah noticed Miss Phillips watching from an upper window, her expression a mixture of disapproval and resignation. The governess had been notably absent from Kareem's daily routine lately, her influence waning as Hassan took a more active role in his son's life. "Miss Bennett," Hassan began, then corrected himself. "Sarah, these past weeks have brought significant changes to our household, changes that have made me reevaluate many things." He paused, watching as Kareem showed Tommy a new origami pattern using his napkin. "I've been reviewing your background," he continued. "Your degree in early childhood education, your experience in developmental psychology, all credentials you downplayed when applying for the housekeeper position." Sarah tensed slightly. "I needed the job, Mr. Al-Rahman. With Tommy's medical expenses—" "Please," he interrupted gently. "I'm not criticizing. In fact, I have a proposal for you." He pulled out a formal document from his briefcase. "I'd like to offer you a new position within the household, not as a housekeeper, but as Kareem's educational coordinator." The offer caught Sarah completely off guard. "But Miss Phillips has tendered her resignation, effective immediately." Hassan completed. "She feels our new educational direction doesn't align with her methods." A slight smile played at the corners of his mouth. "I believe her exact words were, incompatible with traditional standards of excellence. Kareem looked up from his origami, hope shining in his eyes. "Does this mean Sarah and Tommy can stay?" he asked his father. "If they choose to," Hassan replied, his gaze meeting Sarah's. "The position includes accommodations in the family wing, not the staff quarters. Tommy would have access to the same tutors and opportunities as Kareem." And he added, his voice softening, "I believe both boys could benefit from growing up together." Sarah's mind whirled with the implications. The salary Hassan was offering would more than cover Tommy's medical expenses, and the educational opportunities for her son were beyond anything she could provide on her own. But there was something else in Hassan's expression, something that went beyond a mere business proposition. "There's one more thing," Hassan continued, reaching into his briefcase again. He pulled out a familiar-looking paper crane, the one he'd struggled to make that first afternoon. "Kareem tells me that in Japanese tradition, folding 1,000 cranes can grant a wish. I've been practicing, and this morning I completed my 100th crane." "What did you wish for, father?" Kareem asked curiously. Hassan's gaze lingered on Sarah for a moment before turning to his son. "For the courage to build something new," he answered softly. "Something that goes beyond business empires and social expectations." The morning breeze carried the scent of blooming roses as Sarah considered the offer before her. In the boy's laughter and Hassan's transformed demeanor, she saw the possibility of not just a new job, but a new beginning for all of them. 6 months passed, bringing remarkable transformations to the Al-Rahman mansion. Under Sarah's guidance, the household evolved into a vibrant learning environment where education seamlessly blended with joy. The library, once a sanctuary of silence, now hosted animated discussions between Kareem and Tommy as they explored subjects ranging from world cultures to advanced mathematics, all through the lens of their shared interests. Hassan found himself increasingly drawn into their world of discovery. Board meetings now occasionally featured presentations by both boys who demonstrated business concepts through creative projects. The board members, initially skeptical, became enthusiastic supporters of this innovative approach to preparing the next generation of leadership. One particular morning, Hassan discovered something unexpected on his desk, a newspaper article featuring his company. The headline read, "Al-Rahman Industries revolutionizes corporate education. CEO's son leads the way." The article detailed how Kareem's unique educational program had inspired a company-wide initiative, incorporating creative learning methods into employee training and development. "The article doesn't mention the real inspiration behind all this," Hassan remarked to Sarah, who had come to discuss the boys' upcoming project. Their casual meetings had become more frequent lately, extending beyond educational matters to shared observations about life, family, and personal growth. "Sometimes the most important changes start in the smallest ways," Sarah replied, adjusting a vase of fresh flowers on his desk, a habit she'd kept from her housekeeper days. "Like paper cranes and magic tricks." Hassan watched her thoughtfully. Over the months, their professional relationship had evolved into something harder to define. He found himself seeking her opinion on matters far beyond Kareem's education, valuing her insight and the way she challenged his perspectives while respecting his position. The mansion itself reflected their collective transformation. The formal sitting rooms now displayed framed origami art alongside priceless paintings. The garden hosted regular invention afternoons where the boys experimented with engineering concepts, using materials ranging from paper to robotics kits. Mrs. Crawford, who had witnessed the household's evolution with quiet satisfaction, often remarked that the mansion had finally become a true home. Even the staff moved with a new energy, their roles expanding beyond rigid boundaries to contribute to the enriched learning environment. One evening, as Hassan worked late in his study, he overheard Kareem and Tommy in the adjacent room working on their latest project, a presentation about sustainable business practices, illustrated through origami models of eco-friendly buildings. "Your dad's different now," Tommy commented to Kareem. "He laughs a lot more." "So does your mom," Kareem replied. "They both seem happier when they're together." Hassan's pen paused over his documents. The boy's innocent observation brought into focus something he'd been increasingly aware of, but hesitant to acknowledge. His feelings for Sarah had grown beyond appreciation for her professional contributions, developing into something deeper and more personal. The realization both thrilled and terrified him. Cultural expectations, social standings, and corporate politics all presented potential obstacles. Yet as he looked at the 100 paper cranes displayed on his office shelf, each one representing a step in his journey of transformation, he remembered his wish for courage to build something new. The Al-Rahman family's annual charity gala presented the first real test of the changing dynamics within the household. The event drew the city's elite, including Hassan's traditional extended family, who had yet to witness the transformation in their lives. The mansion buzzed with preparation as staff members arranged elaborate decorations, including a stunning display of 1,000 paper cranes created by the entire household. Hassan's mother, Amira Al-Rahman, arrived early to oversee preparations, as she had done every year. Her carefully controlled expression betrayed surprise at the changes in the mansion's atmosphere. The formal portraits had been joined by children's artwork and scientific diagrams. The sound of laughter echoed from the library, where Kareem was rehearsing his presentation for the gala with Tommy. "Hassan," she addressed her son privately, "there are rumors about your relationship with the boy's teacher." Her tone carried generations of cultural expectations and social propriety. "Former housekeeper turned educational coordinator," Hassan corrected gently. "Sarah has revolutionized not just Kareem's education, but our entire corporate training program." "And that's all?" Amira pressed, her eyes sharp with maternal insight. Before Hassan could respond, Sarah appeared in the doorway, elegant in a conservative evening gown that respected traditional sensibilities while maintaining her own style. She carried a portfolio of the children's latest achievements, prepared for the gala's educational initiative presentation. "Mrs. Al-Rahman," Sarah greeted Amira respectfully, "I hope you'll join us for the boys' demonstration. They've integrated traditional Arabic geometric patterns with modern origami techniques to explain mathematical concepts." Amira studied Sarah with the careful assessment of a woman who had navigated complex social waters her entire life. "Tell me, Miss Bennett, what do you know of our culture's values regarding family and tradition?" "I know they're rooted in respect, wisdom, and the preservation of heritage," Sarah replied thoughtfully. "Which is why Kareem's curriculum includes extensive study of Arabic language, literature, and cultural history. We believe innovation and tradition can strengthen each other." The evening unfolded like a carefully choreographed dance of old and new. Kareem and Tommy's presentation captivated the audience, seamlessly blending cultural heritage with modern educational approaches. The boy, who had once been too timid to speak at family gatherings, now commanded attention with confident enthusiasm. As the gala progressed, Hassan noticed his mother's expression softening as she watched Sarah interact with various family members. Sarah's genuine respect for their culture and her intelligent engagement in discussions about tradition and progress seemed to make an impression. The pivotal moment came during Kareem's demonstration of a complex geometric origami pattern. He explained it first in perfect Arabic, then in English, his voice carrying the same passion Hassan remembered from his own childhood, before cultural expectations had buried those emotions. "You've done what I couldn't," Amira said quietly to Hassan as they watched Kareem. "You've found a way to preserve our values while allowing the next generation to find their own path." She paused, glancing at Sarah, who was helping Tommy adjust his traditional thobe. Sometimes the best way to honor tradition is to allow it to grow. Later that evening, as the guests departed, Hassan found Sarah in the garden, contemplating the paper crane display illuminated by soft lights. The gentle breeze carried the scent of jasmine, and distant music drifted from the remaining festivities. The success of the gala marked a turning point in the Al-Rahman household. Hassan's family, initially skeptical of the changes, began to see the wisdom in blending tradition with progress. Amira, in particular, became an unexpected ally, sharing stories of Hassan's childhood that helped bridge the gap between generations. One morning, Amira arrived unannounced, carrying a beautifully carved wooden box. She found Hassan and Sarah in the garden, watching the boys practice calligraphy. "I've been thinking," she said, opening the box to reveal yellowed photographs and old papers about what it means to preserve our heritage. Among the memories was a photograph of young Hassan performing in a school play, a moment of joy his father had dismissed as frivolous. There were also his early attempts at poetry, written in careful Arabic script, dreams put aside in favor of business ledgers. "Your father," Amira said softly, "believed he was protecting our legacy, but perhaps in trying to preserve everything unchanged, we risk losing what matters most." She turned to Sarah, who had been quietly observing. "You've helped my grandson find his voice without losing his roots. That is no small thing." The boys, curious about the gathering, joined them. Kareem's eyes widened at the sight of his father's childhood creative works. "You wrote poetry, father?" Hassan picked up one of his old poems, the paper fragile with age. "I had almost forgotten," he admitted, then began to read the Arabic verses aloud. The words, though written by a child, spoke of dreams and possibilities, of bridges between earth and sky. "It's beautiful," Sarah said softly. "Kareem has inherited your gift for words." She pulled out a recent assignment where Kareem had written his own poetry, combining Arabic and English in a unique expression of his dual heritage. Amira watched the interaction with knowing eyes. "So," she said to Hassan in Arabic, "your father's greatest fear was that modernization would erase our traditions. But look at what has happened here. Tradition and progress dancing together, making each other stronger." The afternoon unfolded into an impromptu celebration of storytelling and shared heritage. Tommy, who had been learning Arabic alongside Kareem, attempted to read one of the simpler poems, his careful pronunciation bringing smiles to everyone's faces. Later, as the boys worked on combining traditional geometric patterns with origami designs, Amira pulled Hassan aside. "I see the way you look at her," she said quietly. "The same way your father used to look at me before he decided that love was a distraction from duty." "Mother," Hassan began, but Amira raised her hand. "Listen to me, my son. I kept quiet when your father's fears became your prison. I won't make the same mistake twice." She touched his cheek gently. "Our traditions teach us to honor family, above all else. Sometimes that means having the courage to build a new kind of family." In that moment, watching Sarah help the boys with their artwork, Hassan felt the last weights of old expectations fall away. The paper cranes hanging in his office had multiplied. He was now at 950. Each fold brought him closer to the wish he'd finally found the courage to make. On a warm spring morning, exactly 1 year after Sarah first entered the Al Rahman mansion, Hassan completed his 1,000th paper crane. The entire household gathered in the garden to celebrate, not just the achievement, but the journey it represented. The paper birds, strung together in rainbow cascades, transformed the space into a magical wonderland. Kareem and Tommy had spent weeks helping the staff arrange the display, incorporating Arabic calligraphy and geometric patterns into the presentation. Each crane carried a small note inside, memories, hopes and dreams written by everyone who had been part of their transformation. "Father," Kareem called out, holding the final crane, the first one Hassan had made, slightly crumpled but carefully preserved. "Isn't it time to make your wish? You've reached 1,000. Hassan looked around at the gathering. Mrs. Crawford stood beside Amira, both women sharing knowing smiles. The staff, no longer bound by rigid hierarchies, mingled comfortably with corporate executives who had come to witness what they'd begun calling the Al Rahman Renaissance. "Actually," Hassan said, his voice carrying clearly across the garden, "I made my wish long ago with that very first crane you're holding." He walked towards Sarah, who was adjusting Tommy's tie. The wish was for courage. Courage to break free from the constraints of the past. Courage to build something new. He took her hand gently. "Courage to follow my heart." The garden fell silent as Hassan knelt before her. From his pocket, he withdrew not a ring, but an intricately folded paper flower. Inside, visible through the translucent paper, was the ring his mother had given him that morning, a family heirloom reset to blend traditional Arabic design with contemporary elements. "Sarah Bennett," he said softly, "you came into our lives as a housekeeper and became so much more. You taught us that true tradition isn't about preserving the ashes but keeping the flame alive. You showed me that being a good father and being a successful leader aren't mutually exclusive. Most importantly, you helped me remember who I was, always meant to be." He opened the paper flower, revealing the ring. "Will you help us write the next chapter of our story? Will you marry me?" Sarah's eyes filled with tears as she looked from Hassan to their sons, no longer just Kareem and Tommy, but brothers in every way that mattered. She saw Amira nodding encouragingly, her own eyes glistening. She saw the household staff, who had become family, beaming with joy. "Yes," she whispered, then laughed as both boys launched themselves into a group hug, nearly knocking Hassan over. Amira stepped forward, embracing Sarah warmly. "Welcome to the family, my daughter," she said, in Arabic, then smiled as Sarah responded in the same language, one of many bridges they had built together. The garden erupted in celebration. The 1,000 paper cranes danced in the breeze, their shadows creating patterns across the gathering, ancient geometric designs merging with new forms, just as their lives had merged to create something beautiful and unique. Later that evening, as the family sat together in the library, Kareem discovered something remarkable. "Look," he exclaimed, pointing to the oldest crane, still sitting on Hassan's desk. The paper had worn in such a way that the light shining through it created a pattern on the wall, a perfect blend of Arabic calligraphy and origami shadows, forming the word love in both languages. Hassan pulled Sarah closer, watching their sons excitedly analyze the mathematical probability of such an occurrence. In that moment, he realized that his father had been wrong. Love wasn't a distraction from success. It was the foundation upon which lasting legacies were built. The Al-Rahman mansion, once a symbol of cold perfection, had transformed into a home where tradition and innovation danced together, where paper cranes flew alongside ancient wisdom, and where a family's love proved stronger than any corporate empire. Dear listeners, we hope this story of transformation and cultural harmony has touched your hearts. This tale of how paper cranes and love rebuilt a family shows us that tradition and progress can create beautiful music together. If you enjoyed this journey of hearts and heritage, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and like this video. Share your own stories of family bonds and cultural bridges in the comments below. Remember, every family's story deserves to be told, and we bring you unique tales of love and understanding every day. Join us again tomorrow for another touching story that bridges hearts across cultures.